NuData Security recently called for a different way of thinking about fraud detection and protection, saying that companies need to have a fundamental shift in the way they handle authentication by devaluing the data fraudsters have in favor of biometric and behavioral analytics. On today's Cyber Chat, we talk with NuData Security's VP of Customer Success, Ryan Wilk, and VP of Business Development, Robert Capps. We talk about how that approach can help protect against fraud, the challenges facing businesses, and other fraud-related topics such as mobile and EMV. I thought that we would start with some news from the RSA conference that just happened recently. I saw that NuData put out a press release saying that it is calling for a fundamental shift in the way companies handle authentication. And Ryan, I think it was you who was quoted in the press release that said it's a totally different way of thinking about fraud detection and protection. So just wondering if you could explain the thought process behind this approach.
You know, we're really looking at the idea that single data points are becoming less useful in trying to evaluate who a user is and when you're authenticating a user. The traditional world of username and password is becoming less valuable with all the breaches we're seeing. Lists and lists of usernames and passwords are available just online on the dark web. Very easy to obtain those. And the problem is when you attempt to authenticate yourself, if you've entered that username and password properly, you're in. Doesn't matter if it's really the correct holder of that account or if it's a bad actor. They're simply entering those two pieces of data and they have access to the account. When you think about the world of reality and the real world, when you walk into a store, someone sees you, doesn't matter if you're wearing your blue shirt, your red shirt, your glasses, or your contacts, they're able to recognize that it's you since they're actually seeing you and seeing your identity. NuData really looks to bring that idea of the real world into the digital world and understanding the identity of the human behind the machine more so than just simply trying to substantiate a handful of data points that user's entering.
Yeah, and so you guys talk about biometrics and behavioral and analytics. I guess that can be kind of broad. So I was just wondering if you could maybe mention a few sort of specific things that you guys focus on when you try to stop fraud.
So when a user's authenticating themselves within either a banking or an e-commerce environment, we're really looking to understand, is it still that same human that's always authenticated themselves previously? So we're looking to answer a couple questions of when that user is coming on. We're looking to understand, is it the same user that we've seen previously? Is this user acting the same way that we've expected them to act over time? Is this behavior interacting in a way that we would expect for the larger environment? Or has this user deviated from what we've expected, or has the behavior as a whole deviated from what we've expected across that entire user base? So really looking at the behavior of that user, and then taking it even a step further to really understand who the user is and who that human is behind the machine, looking at how they're interacting with either the notebook or with the mobile device. So looking to understand when they're entering their username and password, when they're interacting with it, how are they typing? What's their type speed? What's the type deviation? Do they appear to be left-handed or right-handed? With a mobile device, how are they actually holding that mobile device? What are the accelerometer readings? How much of the screen is actually being plotted on by their finger when they're typing? And being able to pull together all those data points and model those into a profile for that user. So each time that user returns, not only can we say it's the correct device, the correct connection, the correct behavior, but based on how they're actually interacting with the device, we can build out a confidence rating that it truly is the correct human behind the machine authenticating themselves, or potentially has that human now deviated from what was expected, and we're able to tell that even though that username and password were entered correctly, that it's no longer the human that we would expect to be entering that data.
My next question is just kind of want to get to the sense of just what's going on out there in fraud. I know it's kind of a huge subject. So when you're working with these different clients or different enterprises, is there any specific concerns that come up again, or kind of themes, or just wondering kind of what's the sense that you guys get of how everybody's doing out there with fraud?
Oh man, so this is Robert joining in. That's an interesting question. What we're seeing is that most people are just overwhelmed with the sheer amount of breach data that's made its way out to the internet and it's being reused. We see time and time again malicious actors using stolen data, trying to find accounts that work on pretty much any large e-commerce or banking platform. Once they find overlap in that stolen data with those accounts, they get sold to to criminals on the internet who then use that information to commit crimes, whether they're trying to do reconnaissance on an individual's identity through various web properties like their email account or their banking account or even their e-commerce accounts in order to get a good profile on them to go commit identity theft, or they're trying to withdraw funds, or they're trying to order goods on good, legitimate consumer accounts that say like an Amazon or some other large retailer with the hopes of receiving those goods and reselling them. There's just a variety of different ways that data is being used over and over again. And, the big challenge is how do you protect yourself against that? What do you do? What can you do as a retailer or a financial institution or a service provider to protect yourself against the reuse of stolen data, given the fact that consumers have such poor practices when it comes to password hygiene and reuse. And so they're looking for solutions now that allow them to continue to operate with the username and password, potentially even one that's compromised, while still allowing a good customer experience and the ability to identify good customers.
So really it plays into that idea of evaluating the actual data points that are being entered, since regardless if it's the good user or a bad actor, they can obtain lots of data around you to create a new account to authenticate themselves. And really anyone can be entering that data into the screen. And if you're simply trying to substantiate whether that data is correct or not, you're going to have a very hard time determining the level of risk in today's world. With I think last year, over 700 million breaches. The Office of Personnel Management, 22 million breaches there, with not only PII data being released, but also biometric data, so things like fingerprints, active biometrics. So it's becoming very, very hard to use single data points to be able to authenticate that user. So really being able to look and encapsulate the behavior behind the data, so you can start to understand when potentially it's the same behavior trying to log into many different accounts, the same behavior trying to create many different accounts, cycling through data points, using many different sets of PII data, many different sets that they obtain either on the dark web or in different places online, and being able to pull that all together and not just have the net go around the data, but really create the net around the behavior, since behavior is a far harder thing to spoof. Even as we see device IDs cycling, we see IP addresses cycling, we see data points cycling, we're still able to see that underlying behavior that the user is exhibiting when they're trying to interact with the web or mobile experience.
Yeah, I'd be curious to get your guys' thoughts on just what's going on in mobile, because I guess from my point of view, I read all these different headlines, and there's a lot of conflicting stuff out there. I read some headlines that say the mobile malware threat is overhyped and it really doesn't impact very many people. And then some people I talk to say that it really is a big problem and it's being used more for malware and social engineering and fraud. So just wondering your guys' thoughts. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, how does mobile fit into this, and is it a really big concern for a lot of organizations?
Yeah, I mean, mobile at the end of the day is just another computing device. It's just a different form factor that the consumer has to interact with. And frankly, because it's a smaller form factor, sometimes there are trade-offs in the user experience around what's legitimate and what's not. The security indicators that are typically present in a fully fledged browser on a desktop tend to be a bit more obscured when you're working with a mobile device. And then when you get into the mobile apps themselves, a lot of those security indicators disappear completely. How do you trust a device or an application, a native mobile application, when you put your credentials into it, right? You don't have the block icon that shows up in a browser that indicates the browser has a secure connection. You're trusting the application is actually taking the right steps to secure your data. Regarding the malware issue, the mobile malware issue, I'm not sure that it's overblown. I think that it is a concern. The different platforms have gone about protecting the users in different ways. And at the end of the day, malware is present on every platform, period, full stop. It's a threat to users in every platform, some more than others, and some have more capabilities of defending than others. Malware on a traditional desktop, laptop, PC, or a Mac, there are solutions there to try and detect and prevent that. When we get to native mobile applications being downloaded to mobile phones like Android and Apple, Android taking the very open multi-app store approach is a little more exposed, actually quite a bit more exposed, depending on the app store at which you're downloading your apps from and their process of vetting applications in the front door. But even Apple isn't immune from from those sorts of issues. We've seen malicious applications be approved by Apple, not necessarily malware, but collecting data from those devices that are being installed on. It's just a hard problem to solve at the end of the day.
And then just to add to that, based on some of what we're seeing across our user base, and not to downplay the risk of mobile malware, we're seeing a lot of spoofing occurring. So if you start to think about the mobile web experience, you take the traditional www experience, and it's very rich. There's a lot going on there, but you move to the M-web experience, and it becomes a much simpler environment, a much easier environment for a bad actor to script. So we see a lot of malicious activity going against the M-web environment because of its simplified nature. And then what we're also seeing is we're seeing a lot of issues with native app APIs. So not necessarily the actual native app being taken over, but we're seeing a lot of bad actors connecting to those APIs that are used for that native app to be able to interact, and they're scripting those. They're spoofing. They're using spoofing techniques to make it appear it's the app connecting to those APIs. And it becomes very simple, because if you start to think about an API, it's really opening your doors. It's opening your internal systems out to the world. And if you're having other systems come on and attempt to authenticate through those APIs, attempting to create accounts through those APIs, it now opens up a whole new door, a whole new hole in your infrastructure that makes it far easier for these bad actors to come on. So where mobile and the native app world is a problem, I think it's a mixture between, is it actually the app that's the problem, or is it the tools, the APIs that facilitate the app that are creating some of the larger issues as well?
Yeah, and I was wondering if you could talk maybe just a little bit more about, I guess, the differences between these different avenues, whether it's mobile or, just all the different types of fraud out there. Is it something that you guys have to basically look at separate and businesses have to treat each avenue separate, or is it more generally all fall, under one umbrella where you're trying to stop someone who's got stolen credentials from doing something?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, you really need to have a consistent solution for identity management for your customer base. Now, how that identity management solution manifests itself to the customers is highly channel dependent based upon the form factor and the capabilities of each device and whether or not you're on the web or as a native mobile application. You really have to scale, the techniques and the solutions to meet the challenges of those platforms. Building a bit on what Ryan said a moment ago about those mobile APIs or the APIs that web service APIs that are made available to power native mobile applications. Traditional systems of looking for risk and fraud tend to look at indicators of an HTTP web transaction coming from a browser. They're looking at header data. They're looking at velocity data. They're looking at a whole bunch of other signals traditionally going back many, many years, and their fraud systems are tuned to look for these signals. Well, those signals are completely absent in web service calls coming from a mobile application. They don't necessarily have consistent browser strings or the API calls come at a very haphazard or very what will appear to be programmatic fashion based upon code that's sitting inside that mobile application. So it's very difficult in most cases to discern good from bad without some additional tools, new tools in that channel to help you understand what's risk and what's not. So what we're finding now for a lot of merchants is that the web channel, the native mobile channel, produces a lot of false positives in their fraud tools, specifically identifying good users as bad inappropriately, which is causing a lot of problems around conversion, a lot of problems around customer satisfaction, and it's not necessarily impacting the fraud itself, the fraud rate itself. Now, when we start talking, from a NuData perspective, we're somewhat agnostic of the channel. We have solutions that fit into each of our channels, and we've customized them for those channels for our customers so they don't have to think about that stuff. And I think that what we're going to see is that more and more of the solutions around identity management and more of the solutions around anti-fraud and security will start to build very customized solutions, or at least tailored solutions for these different channels using the same technologies. I mean, you just have to. You have to have a consistent view across all channels.
And I think Robert hit on something really important there. It's when you start to think about risk, and you think about risk in an environment, even though it creates a lot of issues for merchants, creates a lot of issues for banks, it's a very small portion of their total user environment. In the e-commerce space, it's on average only about 1% to 2% of all interactions are a risky transaction. So really moving beyond simply looking for fraud and instead looking to understand who your user is, understand what the behavior of your user is, gives you the ability to provide a far better experience to your whole user base. We always use that idea of giving that 98, 99% of your user base a fantastic experience, understanding who they are versus simply always just looking for that risk. If you can substantiate your good user and give your good user that great experience, it allows the risk to fall out on the side, allows those anomalous users to become very evident within the environment. And you can then go and deal with those anomalies, those users that are standing out from what was previously expected, while giving your good users a fantastic experience. And I think that's a major shift within the risk industry as well that we're seeing. When I started in the risk industry, the whole idea was find the fraud, find the fraud. You almost start to get the Chicken Little syndrome where the marketing and sales folks stop inviting you to the meetings because all you say is no. If you can now start to shift the view of the risk industry and shift how you're actually you're looking at what you're doing, it's giving you the ability to now go into these situations and become a facilitator of sales, become a facilitator of revenue within your company while still stopping that risk. It really expands out the role of the risk organization and really becomes more of an assurance organization versus simply trying to stop that fraud. And that's a major message of what NuData is doing, really looking to understand what that good behavior is, who that good user is, give them a fantastic experience, and allow the risk to fall out.
Yeah, and then I wanted to really quick get your guys' opinion on all the stuff going on with EMV. That's one of the big topics, I guess, over the last 6 months is there is this EMV shift, and a lot of people were predicting that once that happened, we were going to see a shift to more online card not present fraud. So just wondering, from your guys' point of view, is that something that you guys are worried about and that you're seeing more of and that businesses are more worried about?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was a little wrong on my predictions about a year ago. I expected that the first thing we would see was a shift to the smaller merchants with card-present fraud. So the large merchants would deploy EMV quickly, and the smaller merchants would be left unprotected. Oddly enough, I was wrong on that one. The smaller merchants are the ones that have all the terminals that are enabled for card. The bigger merchants are dragging their feet because they don't like the additional time it's taking those transactions to clear. Because the larger merchants haven't made the migration, even though we're past that deadline, we haven't seen the shift to online yet. It will come. We've seen it in every market where EMV has been deployed. As soon as it gets out there in mass adoption with the larger retailers, you see those card numbers being reused online, and you see e-commerce fraud spiking. What I think we're going to see here is a two-pronged problem. One is that we will see EMV, because of the delay, we'll see the EMV eventually cause card not present transaction fraud to spike. But at the same time, there are a lot of technologies and programs in place to shift liability for card not present transactions back to the issuers. And when that happens, and we've seen this in every market that has done liability shift for online transactions, like the UK, well, what happens then is the banks now taking liability start declining larger and larger percentages of those transactions. And retailers are really going to, especially online retailers, are really going to feel the pinch of both fraud in an online channel and false declines, overly pessimistic declines by the issuers, which is really going to bite into online commerce over the short to medium term until everything gets sorted out. So it will be painful. Fortunately, we haven't seen it yet.
My view maybe contradicts just slightly, but I also
that's okay.
Just to add to that, I think the U.S. is in a unique position. You look at the UK's transition happened some 10 years ago. Canada's I don't have the exact date, but happened quite a while ago as well, probably around the same time period. The industry has had 10 years or so to progress. The risk industry, the idea of understanding who your customer is. We've gotten much smarter than where we were, and I think the U.S. has always been a brunt of e-commerce fraud from the whole world. It has a disproportional amount of e-commerce shops, and it has the products that everyone wants. So the U.S. has been dealing with this for a long, long time. So I think that there still is going to be the larger transition, the large shops that still need to fully transition over to EMV. That said, we're not doing chip and PIN, we're doing chip and signature, so it is a diluted version of the product. You still, if you have the cards, even though cloning will become much more difficult, you'll still be able to go into a store and very easily use that card without any additional level of verification. So I think there will be I do agree with everything Robert's saying, that there will be a shift and that there will be pain. I question if that pain is going to be as bad as what the UK and Canada saw, just because of the maturity that the US market has now, and the issues the US market's been dealing with well before EMV ever came about, and just the general maturity of that market.
Yeah, that's fair. And in fact, I failed to talk about it a little while ago. Some of that shift in the UK market and other markets occurred to the U.S. as cross-border transactions. So it's unfair to say that we haven't seen it at all, especially during those shifts. But I agree with that.
Then I have kind of a specific question. I'm not sure if you guys have followed this at all, but basically the banks are being sued over EMV. More than 17 banks and credit card companies, including Visa, MasterCard, Chase, Bank of America. Basically, it's an antitrust complaint saying that they all colluded to shift the liability onto these merchants, because I guess apparently there's hundreds of thousands of merchants that claim they've taken the steps to be EMV compliant, but they haven't been certified yet. I thought that was a pretty interesting case, so I was just wondering if you guys knew about that and followed it, and if you have any thoughts on it.
I actually hadn't seen that. I heard rumors about a lawsuit coming, but I hadn't seen that it was actually filed.
We all just frantically Googled, so need to do a little bit of reading up on it.
I would love to say something insightful about it, but I unfortunately don't know much about it. I'm not surprised. I'm really not surprised to see lawsuits like this. There is a concern over the ability to audit and certify these implementations. It shouldn't be as difficult as it is. So I guess we'll see that one work its way through the courts.
It's really like any mandates that the issuers and the card brands put on the merchants. You saw the same thing when PCI came about. It has its growing pains. So we'll obviously need to take a bit more of a look at this, but I'd say that this is probably a natural part of any major kind of shift within the payment industry, that there'll always be some level of concern from the merchants, from the issuers, especially when something as big as the liability shift has happened. Really, in the payment industry, whether it be card not present or card present, there's lots of little ins and outs, but the liability has always been the biggest piece. Who holds the final liability of risk or not risk? Who's going to be out the money when these things happen? So it doesn't surprise me that it's happening. It makes sense that the merchants are trying to make sure that they're in as good a spot as they can, because they're really the ones that are on the hook nowadays.
Final question real quick, just I guess looking forward in terms of fraud, is there anything interesting that stands out to you or any concerns that you guys have?
Oh man, I think that we're finally seeing fraud, and you have to understand, fraud is a subset of information security. It's a cyber attack, just like a denial of service attack or a hack or phishing or anything else. It's a means to an end to derive value from some sort of a technical attack by a criminal. I'm heartened by the fact that this is getting so much play. There's a lot of discussion with data breaches in the news every day, and the average consumer having had their data compromised at least once in recent past. People are thinking about it. There's now a discussion, with InfoSec as being the overarching issue. There's now a discussion and a responsibility at the board level of organizations where that hasn't existed before. And that's really a big piece of addressing the overall information security posture, and our security posture in general as a society requires that this be evaluated and be managed at the highest levels of our organization. That actually makes me feel good about the solutions that are coming about, right? We're actually getting traction with things like EMV. We're actually getting traction with things like information security and get our arms around data breach. That means we're moving in the right direction. We've got a long way to go. We're not going to be there anytime soon, but every day it gets better. So that makes me feel good about the state of the industry.
No, it absolutely is becoming stronger, better systems, better protocols every day. I think the thing we always have to remember, though, is risk and fraud are big business. There's huge ROIs around this. These bad actors are making a lot of money, and they're not just going to close up shop because we put a new control out there, a new protocol out there. It's constantly going to be evolving. It's constantly going to be shifting. So I think that while we are making major headways, by us evolving, we're forcing them to evolve as well. So we'll continue to see what direction the industry goes. Really the idea of behavior and entity is becoming the major hot topic within the card not present world now. Really knowing who's behind that machine. As we keep talking about, the data is becoming less and less valuable, and really needing to know who that human is and who that person is interacting with your environment, and how do you do that in as low of a friction and as friendly a way to your customer as possible. So it's a continual cat and mouse game, but I think that the good guys are starting to catch up a bit.
And that'll do it for this week's Cyber Chat podcast. Big thanks to NuData's Ryan Wilk and Robert Capps for stopping by today. As always, the Cyber Chat podcast is brought to you by Surfwatch Labs. Surfwatch Labs delivers cyber risk intelligence solutions that help organizations understand the potential for cyber attacks, determine the impact to their business, and proactively address threats head-on. For a weekly recap of important cybercrime news, check out Surfwatch Labs' other podcast, the Surfwatch Cyber Risk Roundup. And for more information on cyber risk intelligence, check out surfwatchlabs.com.